Okay, welcome back. So in the final video on this paper, I'd like to think through how to interpret the findings of this paper in light of the various models of discrimination that we've talked through in this class. So this paper provides very strong evidence that resumes that have traditionally African-American names, names like Leroy or Kenya or Ebony, receive different treatment from employers than resumes that have traditionally white names, names like Allison or Brad. This raises a couple of questions that are going to be important for understanding the extent of discrimination in the labor market and the particular dynamics of discrimination in the labor market. So the first question we might want to ask is, can we be sure that these findings are the result of racial discrimination as opposed to some other reason that employers might treat a resume with the name Ebony differently from a resume with the name Allison? Second of all, if we can conclude that this is a result of racial discrimination, if we rule out other possible explanations, can we determine whether the racial discrimination we're seeing is what we've called prejudice-based or taste-based discrimination? In other words, the result of employers not wanting to employ Black workers, despite any potential profit losses resulting from that decision, or whether this is the result of statistical discrimination. In other words, employers trying to draw conclusions about the likely productivity of workers on the basis of their racial identity or their racial identifiers. Third, we might want to know the extent to which we can learn about the racial wage gaps that we saw at the beginning of this lecture from this experiment. In other words, can we conclude that because we see these large differences in callback rates between white and Black workers, and we see these large differences in employment rates and wages between white and Black workers, can we conclude that this sort of discrimination is leading to those differences in wages? And then finally, we can think about what each of the models that we've thought through has to say about this experiment and how consistent the results of this experiment are with each of those models. Okay, so first of all, let's think about whether there's potentially other explanations for employers preferring resumes sent by Brad or Allison to resumes sent by Jamal or Ebony, other than racial discrimination. In other words, is it possible that employers are learning different information about employees from their names than guessing their race? So there's two possibilities here that we might want to explore. The first is that rather than predicting that Jamal or Leroy is more likely to be Black than white, employers might be interpreting name differences as evidence of class differences of employees. In other words, they might believe that employees with traditionally Black names have lower socioeconomic statuses than do employees with traditionally white names. And in this interpretation, perhaps Black workers who don't have traditionally Black names, in other words, Black workers named things like Ann or Brad, might fare as well in the labor market as do white workers with those names. And then the second possibility is, maybe instead of discriminating against employees with Black names, employers are simply discarding resumes that have weird names on them, names that employers are less familiar with. Okay, so let's start with this hypothesis that employers are using names as an indicator of socioeconomic status rather than using names as an indicator of race. So there's a couple things that we can do to find out how likely this explanation is. The first thing is we can say, what if we give employers other information about socioeconomic status other than the racial classification of the employee's name? So the idea here is essentially, if we think that employers are engaging in some sort of statistical discrimination on the basis of name to try to learn about an employee's socioeconomic status, if we give them direct evidence of the employee's socioeconomic status, that should reduce the information content of the employee's name. So the way that the researchers look at this is they see whether resumes that come from high-income zip codes or high-fraction white zip codes or high-education zip codes do better or worse than do resumes that come from lower education zip codes. So the idea here is, if employers are trying to learn about employees' socioeconomic status from their names, then seeing that a potential employee comes from a high-income neighborhood should lead employers to believe that that employee is more likely to be high socioeconomic status, regardless of their name. And what they're going to find is that indeed, applications that come from high socioeconomic status zip codes, so that is zip codes that have a high fraction white, a high fraction of residents with a college education or more, and high per capita incomes, do indeed have higher callback rates than applications that come from low socioeconomic status zip codes. However, if we look at the relationship between zip code characteristics and having an African American name, what we're going to see is that coming from a high education or high fraction white or high per capita income zip code doesn't do anything to change the relative callback rates of white and black applicants. In other words, a white and black applicant that come from a high income zip code are going to have the same difference in callback rates than a white and black applicant that come from a low socioeconomic status zip code. Right? So we're going to see basically the same penalty applied to a black name when we know that an applicant is coming from a high status zip code as when we know that an applicant is coming from a low status zip code. And so this is going to provide some evidence against this socioeconomic status hypothesis, because we should expect that if we give employers countervailing evidence that a black applicant is in fact high socioeconomic status, that would reduce the rate of the amount of discrimination that they face. So the second way that the researchers determine whether employers are discriminating on the basis of perceived socioeconomic status rather than discriminating on the basis of perceived race is they look at the actual information encoded in first names about the socioeconomic status of children given that name. So in these birth records that they use to determine whether names were disproportionately likely to be held by white versus black children, employers are also able to see the likelihood that your mother has a high school education or more for children given each name. So essentially they can say what percentage of mothers of Emily's have a high school education versus what percentage of mothers of Aisha's have a high school education. So in doing this, they are going to find that the children given traditionally white names do have higher rates of mother education than do children given traditionally black names. As you can see here, the average high school graduation rate of children given traditionally white names is about 92%, as opposed to about 61% for children given traditionally black names. This also means that children with white names have higher rates of mother education than do white children overall. Children given traditionally black names have lower rates of mother education than do black children overall. So this provides some evidence for the idea that having a traditionally black name or a disproportionately black name increases the likelihood that you're from a lower socioeconomic status. However, the other thing that they do is they look to see whether the names that they use have different callback rates from each other. So as you can see, among these disproportionately black names, there are some pretty significant differences in the likelihood that your mother has a high school education. So children named Aisha, for example, have 77% of Aishas have a high school educated mother, whereas only 30% of Latanyas have a high school educated mother. So to the extent that employers know about the socioeconomic status differences between these names and really care about the socioeconomic status of children rather than their likelihood of being black, we would expect that Aishas would receive higher rates of callback than Latanyas. In fact, we see that there's no relationship or even a negative relationship between the likelihood that your mother is high school educated on the basis of your name and your likelihood of getting called back. So in fact, Aishas get called back at a lower rate than Latanyas. Now, the extent to which we're going to find this convincing is really going to depend on whether we think that the typical employer is likely to know that Aishas have a higher rate of mother education than Latanyas, as opposed to knowing a more general rule that typically black names are more likely to be given to children by less educated mothers than by more educated mothers. So we receive even clearer evidence against this socioeconomic status hypothesis if we look at men's names, because men with these disproportionately African American first names have similar rates of mother's education as do all African American men. In other words, it's really not informative about somebody's likely socioeconomic status to know that their name is Rashid or Tyrone or Leroy if you already know that they're African American. And again, just as with women, we don't see any relationship between the average education of mothers giving these names to their children and the likelihood of children getting a callback. So you can see here that Leroy's and Jermaine's have a 53% or 57% mother high school graduation rate, whereas Rashid's have a 77% mother high school graduation rate. But Rashid's are actually less likely to be called back by interviewers than are Leroy's or Jermaine's. And similarly, if we look at traditionally white names, we see some pretty big differences between mother's likelihood of getting a high school education. So almost 97% of Brendan's have a high school have high school graduate mothers, for example, as opposed to only about 85% of J's and 85% of Neil's. But J's and Neil's are getting callbacks from employers at about the same rate as Brendan's. So to the extent that employers are using names to discriminate on the basis of socioeconomic status, they're not doing a very good job of it. They don't have very refined models of statistical discrimination. And then, of course, the second possibility that we worried about is that rather than representing discrimination against African Americans, employer behavior simply represented discrimination against people with unusual names. We can rule this out largely on the basis of the fact that these traditionally African American names are fairly common. When the researchers looked at the likelihood of being given one of these names among white and black boys and girls born in Massachusetts in the mid-1970s, they found that actually a higher percentage of African Americans were given a name from their set of traditionally African American names than whites given a name from their distribution of traditionally white names. We would also expect, if we thought that this was about the unusual nature of these names, that we would see less discrimination in Chicago than in Boston, because Chicago has a much larger African American population than Boston. Overall, the Chicago metro area is about 17% black, whereas the Boston metro area is about 7% black. And the differences within the city of Chicago versus the city of Boston are larger. So what this means is that Chicago-based employers really should be familiar with all of the names on this traditionally African American list. Okay, so if we believe that these results represent discrimination against African Americans, this leads to the question of, is this a result of employer tastes? In other words, are employers discriminating against African Americans because they're willing to accept a loss in profits in order to avoid hiring African Americans? Or is this discrimination statistical in nature? In other words, are employers drawing statistically accurate conclusions about the likely productivity of workers on the basis of their race? So, of course, we can't look at this directly, but there's a couple things that we can use to give us some evidence of which of these is more likely. So, first of all, if we thought that this was likely to represent statistical discrimination, what that would mean is that employers are trying to draw conclusions about employee characteristics on the basis of race, and that those conclusions have important implications for employers about workers' likely productivity. So, essentially, statistical discrimination requires two things. The first is differences in average characteristics by race. So in other words, white and black workers having different average characteristics. And the second thing being that those characteristics are important for the worker's productivity. So we thought about this in terms of yacht salesmen, right? That having rich friends might be important for your likelihood of selling yachts, and that white workers might have more rich friends on average than black workers. We also thought of this in the Cotelowry model, right? That there might be various kinds of skills that employers can't directly measure that might be more important for some jobs than others, right? More important for engineering jobs than for laborer jobs. So if we were observing statistical discrimination, what we would expect to see is that A, statistical discrimination would be larger when employers have a harder time determining the characteristics of workers, and B, that statistical discrimination should be larger in jobs that require skills that are more likely to be possessed by white versus black workers than in jobs that don't require those skills. So in fact, the researchers are able to look at the relative callback rates of white versus black workers in jobs that list various types of requirements. So essentially they can look at whether this rate of discrimination, this difference in callback rates, is higher in relatively more demanding jobs or jobs with relatively more requirements than in jobs with relatively fewer requirements. If these differences in callbacks were reflecting a difference in the likelihood of meeting job requirements among white and black employees, what we would expect is that jobs that have fewer requirements would have less discrimination against black employees. In fact, what we see is that the various kinds of requirements that the researchers are able to measure, right, whether the job lists any requirements at all, whether the job has requirements for experience, for computer skills, etc., has almost no relationship at all to the callback rates of white versus black employees, or resumes with white versus black names. So this is evidence against statistical discrimination because this suggests that relatively more demanding jobs are no less likely to hire African Americans than are relatively less demanding jobs. In the context of, for example, our Cotelowry model, this would suggest that engineer jobs are discriminating against African Americans in exactly the same way that laborer jobs are. Okay, so if this evidence isn't very consistent with statistical discrimination, does it line up well with taste-based discrimination? So remember, when we think about taste-based discrimination, we're going to think about employers being less willing to hire African American workers because the employers themselves don't like to hire African American workers. In other words, we're going to expect that more prejudiced employers are going to discriminate more against African Americans than our less prejudiced employers. So the ideal test for this would be to have some measure of employer prejudice and then compare the callback rates for more prejudiced employers to the callback rates of less prejudiced employers. Of course, we don't have an ideal measure of employer prejudice, right? In an ideal world, we would simply ask the employers, are you prejudiced? And they would tell us the honest answer. But we do have a couple of indications of this. So the first thing is that about 30% of the employers in this sample describe themselves as equal opportunity employers. That is, they claim on their ads that they treat employees the same regardless of race. Now, this might not be a great indication of whether an employer is prejudiced or not. It's probably more of an indication of whether an employer has an HR department or not. But to the extent that it tells us something, we might expect equal opportunity employers to have higher callback rates for African American workers than do employers that don't call themselves equal opportunity. Instead, what we see is that there's no difference whatsoever, that the callback rates are exactly the same between equal opportunity employers and employers who don't call themselves equal opportunity. Likewise, we might expect that federal contractors would be more likely to hire African American workers than would private employees that are not federal contractors. The reason for this is because federal contractors face a large number of employment discrimination regulations above and beyond the regulations faced by other types of employers. But again, we see that if anything, federal contractors are a little bit less likely to call back African American workers relative to white workers than are employers that are not federal contractors. And likewise, we don't really see any differences if we look at the number of employees of firms, which might give us a sense of how much the person making hiring decisions is going to be working with the employee that they're hiring, right? We don't really see any differences by ownership. We see a slightly higher likelihood of calling back African Americans among nonprofits versus for-profit employers. And we see a substantially higher likelihood of calling back African Americans among employers that are based in neighborhoods that have higher numbers of African Americans. But overall, we don't see very big differences on the basis of characteristics that are likely to be associated with employers' tastes for discrimination. So we're not seeing very strong evidence for statistical discrimination, but we're not seeing very strong evidence for taste-based discrimination either. Okay, so the third thing we might want to know from this experiment is what are the broader implications for Black workers of this discrimination? In particular, can we conclude that because Black workers are receiving lower callback rates on their resumes, that Black workers are facing lower wages as a result of discrimination? And I want to be clear about why this is going to be a difficult thing to answer by going back to Becker's employer-based taste discrimination model. Right, so if we remember, we have a model where we can put our employers by their preference for discrimination, right, from the least prejudiced to the most prejudiced, and then we can put their taste for discrimination D here, and where did I put 0 here, right? So we might imagine that we have some body of unprejudiced employers, and then some number of employers who are prejudiced. And in this model, right, we'll end up with a Black-white wage difference set by the marginal employee. So, or the marginal employer, right? So if the marginal employer was prejudiced, we would end up with a Black-white wage difference that's greater than 0. But if the marginal employer wasn't prejudiced, we would end up with a Black-white wage difference of 0, right? And in this case, we would end up with all of these employers, all the unprejudiced employers, having integrated workforces, right? All of these employers would be indifferent between hiring a Black or white worker because they're unprejudiced and they have to pay the workers the same amount. Whereas all of these employers, all of the prejudiced employers, would only hire white workers. So as a result, if we think about this model, we're going to end up with lower callback rates for Black workers than for white workers in this model, even though we end up with the same equilibrium wages. And the reason for that, right, if we sent a resume to every single one of these employers, 0 to 100, all of the unprejudiced employers would respond equally to white and black named resumes, but all of these prejudiced employers would only respond to the resumes with white names. So if we thought this was the model of the economy, we might conclude from Bertrand and Mullinathan's results that something like 1/3 of employers are unwilling to hire black workers. This means that black workers need to send more resumes in order to get the same number of callbacks as white workers, which is a real cost, but that we might not end up with equilibrium wage differences as a result of that discrimination because the marginal employer is still unprejudiced. So this is maybe the hopeful story that says that while Bertrand and Mullinathan have proven that some employers are prejudiced, they haven't proven that the wage gap that we see between black and white workers is the result of discrimination. And we could imagine the same sort of story, right, if we thought about employee-based discrimination. Employee-based discrimination is going to tell us that we'll end up, in Becker's model with segregated workplaces that pay the same wages. Well, because of the fact that both the Boston and Chicago metro areas have a larger number of white workers than black workers, we would expect a larger number of segregated white-only workplaces than segregated black-only workplaces, right? And that would give us the same difference in callbacks without necessarily generating a difference in wages. On the other hand, we might have larger prejudice-driven wage differences than are predicted in this model, right? If we want to expand our definition of prejudice to include things like nepotism towards particular white friends, we might expect that white workers on average have wealthier and more well-connected social networks than black workers. And as a result, that nepotism is going to help white workers more than it helps black workers. Because all of the resumes being sent in this experiment are fake, right, from fictitious people. None of these people have any friends. None of these people are benefited from nepotism. So it could be that we're, in fact, underestimating the negative effects for black workers of discrimination, if we define discrimination a little bit more broadly. The last thing we might want to think about, if we want to think about the effect of these callback rates on wages, is maybe the callbacks that fictitious black workers are losing are somehow marginal callbacks. In other words, it could be that we're not going to see effects further along in the hiring process from this reduced number of callbacks, because this extra third of interviews that black workers aren't receiving are unlikely to result in a job anyway. If we imagine that the way employers hire is they call 10 people in for interviews, but they really are only considering 1 or 2, it could be that the shoe-ins for the interviews are getting called whether they're white or black, and it's just these marginal interviews that are being lost. But there's not many ways that we can tell about that based on the data that we have. Okay, so the last thing that I want to do is walk through how to interpret these results according to a series of different models. And I'll do this somewhat lightning round style because I've talked for long enough and you guys can get back to your lives. So we've talked a little bit already about how to fit these results into the Becker employer model. Right, in the Becker employer model, we might expect to see some difference in callback rates between white and black workers, even if on the margin, there's no difference in earnings between white and black workers. In other words, there's a slight refinement we need to make to the prediction of the Becker model that in a general equilibrium, in a competitive equilibrium, prejudiced employers are driven out of the marketplace, which is that prejudiced employers are driven out of the marketplace only until wage differences between black and white workers have been eliminated. Once the marginal employer is unprejudiced, right, once we have a D star equal to 0, and no difference in earnings between black and white workers, it's no longer costly for prejudiced employers to indulge in their prejudices. So in this model, we would essentially say that as long as we've got a difference in callback rates that's small enough to be a consequence purely of a small number of prejudiced employers or a non-marginal number of prejudiced employers, we could end up with behavior like Bertrand and Mullinathan observed continuing to exist in the long-run equilibrium, right? And because of the fact that the metro areas we're looking at, Chicago and Boston, are only 17% black and 7% black, we could potentially have a large number of prejudiced employers in an equilibrium with no wage gaps driven by prejudice. Okay, so the issue with this, right, the evidence against this being driven by a Becker employer model is that, as we've talked about, we don't really see much evidence that things we expect to be correlated with employer prejudice are correlated with your likely callback rates, which kind of puts a damper on the hypothesis, makes it a little bit less likely that what we're seeing is driven by employer prejudice. Okay, so the second model we might want to think about is the Becker employee model. So as you remember, right, in the Becker employee model, we might imagine that some fraction of white workers are prejudiced and prefer not to work with black workers, whereas black workers are unprejudiced and don't care whether they work with black or white workers. And of course, we can have variants of this model where black workers are also prejudiced. It doesn't have a huge effect on the final results. But if we imagine that some fraction of white workers are prejudiced, and they're the only workers who are prejudiced, the conclusion of the model is going to be that prejudiced white workers will work in white-only workplaces, but will end up with the same equilibrium wages as black workers. Essentially, there will be some workplaces that hire only white workers, other workplaces that will be happy to hire white or black workers, but if all white workers are prejudiced, we'll only end up with black workers. So in this model, we would end up with a conclusion that a larger number of workplaces in majority white metro areas like Chicago or Boston would be willing to hire white workers than would be willing to hire black workers. In other words, we might see callback rate differences such as the ones that we observe here. However, we would expect those callback rate differences to reflect the relative size of the black versus white workforce within different cities and within different industries and occupations. So because of the fact that Chicago has a larger number of black workers than Boston, if we were looking at an employee prejudice model, we would generally expect to see a smaller difference in white versus black callback rates in Chicago than we see in Boston. And likewise, if we look across different industries and occupations, we would expect to see a smaller difference in white versus black callback rates in industries and occupations that had a larger relative share of African American workers. Instead, what Bertrand and Mullinathan find is a very consistent difference in callback rates that's no different between Chicago and Boston, and is also no different across different industries and occupations that have different sizes of wage gaps overall and also different sizes of African American workforces. So it's a little bit difficult to reconcile a lot of these findings with an employee discrimination model. Okay, so the last of Becker's discrimination models that we might want to think about is Becker's customer discrimination model. So remember, in the customer discrimination model, we think that rather than employees or employers having prejudices against black workers, perhaps some customers have prejudice against black workers, such that black workers are going to be less productive from the perspective of their employees in jobs that involve heavy customer-employee interaction. And so in this model, the prediction of this model is that in equilibrium, occupations that are more customer-facing are going to be dominated by white employees, and occupations that are less customer-facing are going to be dominated by black employees. The problem with this, the problem with reconciling the Bertrand and Mullinathan findings with this hypothesis is that, again, we don't see large differences in the rates of discrimination faced by African American workers by industry and occupation. And to the extent that we do see those differences, they go in the opposite direction as would be predicted by the Becker customer discrimination model. So for example, Bertrand and Mullinathan find that there's a larger difference in callback rate for women in sales jobs than for women in administrative jobs. A white woman in a sales job is about 22% more likely to be called back than a black woman applying for a sales job, whereas a white woman in an administrative job is about 60% more likely to be called back than a black woman in an administrative job. So if we thought that this was a customer-facing, if this was about customer-facing jobs, we would generally expect to see the lowest callback rates for black workers in sales jobs that have the highest amount of customer interaction. Okay, so the last two models that we want to consider are these non-Becker models, right? The Cotelowry model and then the Bossy model. So just as a reminder, the basic idea behind the Cotelowry model is that if employers aren't able to perfectly distinguish between skilled and less skilled workers, in other words, if they believe that some less skilled workers are able to get high quality credentials by luck, they might discount the credentials of employees that come from groups that they believe to be less skilled. And that in turn, that statistical discrimination, that discrimination against groups believed to have lower average abilities, will lead to a reduced incentive for marginalized groups to invest in skills that are valued by those employers. So we're not going to be able to directly test most of the assumptions or implications of this model, given this very simple framework. But one thing that we can say that's consistent with the Cotelowry model is that we see lower returns to a higher quality resume among black workers than white workers in this experiment, right? We see that white workers' likelihood of getting called for a job is increasing in the quality of their resume to a much greater degree than our black workers' likelihood of being called for a job. And what that suggests is that, consistent with the Cotelowry model, the returns to acquiring higher skills are going to be lower for black workers than they are for white workers. if these differences in callback represent differences in the likelihood of actually getting a job or the likelihood of getting paid a high wage. So while we can't directly test the Cotelowry model, we can say that the nature of discrimination that's observed in this experiment is exactly the type of discrimination that would likely generate differences in returns to skill among groups that's necessary for the Cotelowry model to work. Okay, and then the last model we'll talk about, and then I'll let you get on with your wonderful and interesting lives, is the Bossy model. So as you can remember, right, the Bossy model is about employers hiring workers on the basis of strategic complementarities. In other words, if I'm looking to hire a worker who's going to be as productive as possible for me, I'm going to want to hire someone who's going to be treated well by other agents in their life that will increase their productivity. So if I'm going to hire a sales worker, I'm going to want to hire a sales worker who's going to have good rapport with customers and is going to have good rapport with suppliers, right? And meanwhile, the customers and the suppliers are going to be more interested in working with a sales representative that they think has better access to the company that they represent, right? Can do more for them with the company that they represent. So in this model, what we would expect is that discrimination would be focused in those occupations where strategic complementarities exist, which we believe to be particularly at the higher levels and the managerial levels of occupations. So while it's possible that this broad-based discrimination that we see against Black workers is consistent with the Bossy model, in part because the Bossy model is very, very simple, right? It doesn't have a lot of specific predictions. We don't see a lot of evidence here that's very strongly suggestive of the Bossy model. We don't see, for example, that this discrimination is particularly concentrated in high-level or managerial jobs. That said, this particular type of strategy is maybe particularly poorly suited to finding Bossy-style discrimination, because the kind of jobs that the Bossy model is going to apply to most strongly are the kind of jobs where you're least likely to get an interview on the basis of a context-free resume. Okay, thank you so much for sticking with me. I'm really looking forward to discussing this paper with you in more detail, and I hope that you're having a fantastic day.